What if the most dangerous weapon ever aimed at ordinary people wasn't a gun, a bomb, or a law? What if it was a printing press? Not the kind that prints newspapers or books, the kind that prints money. Endlessly, quietly, in the middle of the night, while you sleep, while you work, while you save every penny you can scrape together, trusting that tomorrow your money will buy what it buys today. That trust is the trap. And the story of how that trap was sprung with brutal, catastrophic precision happened in one country, in one decade, in a way so extreme that it reads like fiction. But it isn't fiction. It is history. And the people who understand it sleep differently at night than the people who don't. This is the story of Weimar Germany. This is the story of hyperinflation so savage that a loaf of bread cost more than a house had cost the year before. This is the story of ordinary, hardworking, responsible people who did everything right, saved their money, followed the rules, and woke up one morning to discover that the rules had been changed while they were sleeping. Their savings were gone. Not stolen in a robbery, not lost in a bad investment, just gone, evaporated, made worthless by the very government that had promised to protect them. But here is the part that nobody teaches in school. Here is the part that gets buried under the economic textbooks and the dry statistics. The hyperinflation of Weimar Germany wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a natural disaster like a flood or an earthquake. It was a series of choices, deliberate choices made by men in suits, in government buildings, with full knowledge of what those choices would do to the people outside those buildings. And the reason you need to know this story isn't because it happened 100 years ago in a country that no longer exists. You need to know this story because the mechanics, the exact same mechanics, are still in use today. The printing press never stopped. It just got quieter. So let's go back. Let's walk the streets of Berlin in the early 1920s. Let's stand in the bread line. Let's feel what it felt like to watch your entire life's work dissolve into paper. Because if you can feel it, you might just be able to protect yourself from it. Picture a man. Let's call him Heinrich. He is 53 years old in 1921. He has worked his entire adult life in a textile factory in the city of Leipzig. He wakes at 5 in the morning. He walks to work in the dark. He eats a modest lunch. He brings home a modest wage. He and his wife Greta have raised 3 children in a small but clean apartment. They have not taken holidays. They have not bought things they could not afford. They have, month after month, year after year, put a portion of their wages into a savings account at the local bank. By 1921, Heinrich has accumulated what he considers a small fortune, enough to retire, enough to buy a small house in the countryside, enough to live out his final years in dignity, away from the factory floor, away from the noise and the dust and the machine oil. He has done everything that society told him to do. He has been patient. He has been disciplined. He has been responsible. And society is about to betray him in a way he cannot yet imagine. Because across town, in government offices and central bank chambers, decisions are being made. Germany has just emerged from the First World War, a war it lost, completely and humiliatingly. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, has handed Germany a bill that is essentially designed to be unpayable. The Allied powers want reparations. They want compensation for the destruction of the war, and they want an almost incomprehensible amount of money. The figure they settle on is 132 billion gold marks. To put that in terms that a human mind can actually hold, that sum in 1921 is more than Germany's entire annual economic output. It is not a fine, it is a financial execution. It is a number designed to keep Germany on its knees for generations. Germany cannot pay it, not in gold, not in goods, not in anything real. So the German government does what governments have always done throughout history, across every civilization. Whenever they have a debt they cannot pay with honest money, they reach for the printing press. At first, it seems almost manageable. More paper marks are printed. Germany uses them to buy foreign currency. The foreign currency is used to pay a portion of the reparations. The German mark weakens a little. Prices rise a little. But a little feels survivable. A little feels like a temporary inconvenience, not a catastrophe. Heinrich notices that his groceries cost slightly more in 1921 than they did in 1920. He grumbles about it over dinner. Greta clips coupons. They tighten their belts a notch. They tell themselves it will pass. It does not pass. By 1922, the printing has accelerated. Not because anyone has found a solution to the debt, but because printing money to cover your debts is an addiction, and like all addictions, you need more of it each time to get the same effect. The government is now also printing money to cover its own operating expenses, because tax revenue is nowhere near enough to fund a government trying to rebuild a shattered country while simultaneously paying war reparations. The mark begins to slide. Then it doesn't slide anymore. It falls. Then it doesn't fall. It plummets. In January of 1921, $1 American could buy roughly 90 German marks. By January of 1922, that same dollar could buy 182 marks. By July of 1922, it could buy 493 marks. The numbers are starting to get uncomfortable, but they are still numbers a human mind can hold. That is about to change. In January of 1923, France and Belgium made a decision that poured gasoline onto a fire that was already burning out of control. Germany had fallen behind on its reparations payments, specifically on deliveries of timber and telegraph poles. In response, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, and occupied it. The Ruhr was the engine room of the German economy. Coal mines, steel factories, manufacturing plants, all of it suddenly under foreign military control. The German government's response was to call for passive resistance. German workers were told to stop working, to refuse to cooperate with the occupiers. The government would pay their wages anyway. And where would the government get the money to pay the wages of hundreds of thousands of workers who weren't producing anything? "You already know the answer," the printing press screamed. By the summer of 1923, the German mark had entered a realm of numbers that no longer correspond to anything a human being can intuitively understand. In July of 1923, $1 bought 1 million marks. In August, it bought 100 million marks. In November, at the peak of the madness, $1 American could buy 4,200 billion German marks. Read that again. 4,200 billion marks for $1. Heinrich's savings account, the one he had spent 30 years filling, the one that represented his dignity and his future and his freedom, was now worth less than a single postage stamp. Not metaphorically, literally. A postage stamp cost more than his life savings. He did not go out for dinner to process this. He sat at his kitchen table in Leipzig, in the apartment he could no longer afford to heat, and he stared at the wall. His wife did not speak. There was nothing to say. Now, let us understand how this actually works. Because here is where most people check out of history class. The numbers get too big. The eyes glaze over. And that is exactly where the understanding dies, and where the vulnerability begins. Forget the trillions for a moment. Let us understand the mechanism. The simple, ugly, repeatable mechanism that turns a government's problem into a citizen's catastrophe. When a government prints money, what is it actually doing? It is not creating wealth. Wealth is things. Wealth is food, houses, machines, labor, knowledge. Wealth is real. Paper is not real. Paper is a promise. A promise that says, I will give you this much of the real stuff in exchange for this piece of paper. When the government prints more paper without creating more real stuff, it is diluting the promise. Think of it like a glass of orange juice. If you have one glass of orange juice and you pour in a glass of water, you now have 2 glasses of something, but neither of them is as good as the original. The juice has been diluted, the flavor is weaker, the nutrition is weaker, the value is weaker. Money works the same way. If there are 1 million marks in circulation and 1,000 loaves of bread in the economy, each loaf costs 1,000 marks. Simple enough. But if the government prints another 1 million marks and there are still only 1,000 loaves of bread, each loaf now costs 2,000 marks. Nothing about the bread changed. Nothing about the need for bread changed. Only the number of marks changed. And because there are more marks and the same amount of bread, each mark is now worth half of what it was before. This is inflation. Not the complicated academic version, the simple criminal version. Now, multiply that by a factor that breaks the human imagination. That is hyperinflation. But there is a subtlety here that is even darker than the simple mathematics. And this subtlety is the part that should make you genuinely angry, not just intellectually curious. When the government first prints new money, who gets it first? The government does. The banks do. The politically connected corporations do. They spend it at today's prices before the market has had time to realize there is more money in the system. By the time ordinary people like Heinrich get their wages, the new money has already started circulating. Prices have already started rising. Heinrich is always at the back of the line. He gets the diluted version. He gets the watered-down orange juice. And his savings, which he cannot spend and re-spend quickly enough to stay ahead of the rising prices, simply evaporate. This phenomenon has a name. Economists call it the Cantillon effect, named after Richard Cantillon, an Irish-French economist who described it in the 1700s. It is not a new idea. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented, understood, and completely ignored feature of monetary systems that print money without constraint. The people closest to the money printer win. The people furthest from it lose. And the people who saved, who were most responsible, who were most trusting of the system, they lose the most because they are holding the most paper. Heinrich is not an accident of history. Heinrich is a predictable outcome. He was produced by the system, exactly as designed. Let us talk now about what 1920s Germany actually looked like on the ground. Because history, when taught through numbers and treaties and monetary policy, loses its body. It loses its smell and its texture and its human weight. In the summer of 1923, workers in Germany were being paid twice a day, not because the factories were generous, because by lunchtime, the money you earned in the morning was already worth less than it was when you received it. You had to spend it instantly, frantically, before the hour turned, before the price at the bakery was updated, before your wages became worthless pieces of paper in your pocket. People wheeled money to the store in wheelbarrows. This is the image that history books show, usually with a kind of dark humor, as if it is almost comical. It is not comical. It is terrifying. Imagine your entire month's wages physically weighing more than you can carry. Imagine needing a wheelbarrow full of paper to buy a single loaf of bread. And then imagine that someone steals your wheelbarrow but leaves the money behind because the wheelbarrow is worth more. That actually happened. The middle class was erased, not reduced, not diminished, erased. The teachers, the doctors in private practice, the small business owners, the factory foremen, the accountants, the engineers who had saved and invested in government bonds, all of them watched their financial lives dissolve. The farmers who owned physical land and produced physical food came through it with something. The industrialists who owed debts, who had borrowed real money and could now repay it with worthless money, they came through it with everything and often with more. Think about that for a moment. The debtors won, the savers lost. The people who had been reckless were rescued by the chaos. The people who had been responsible were punished by it. There's no neutral word for what this does to a society's sense of justice. It does not create cynicism. It creates something deeper and darker than cynicism. It creates a bone-level distrust of every institution, every authority, every promise written on paper. It creates a population that has been told, by direct lived experience, that the rules are for suckers, that discipline is punished, that the game is rigged. It is not a coincidence that this is the precise economic and psychological environment in which Adolf Hitler found his early audience. This is not a political statement. It is a historical observation. A population that has been economically humiliated, that has watched a lifetime of savings become worthless paper, that has learned that the institutions they trusted were either incompetent or dishonest. That population is hungry for someone who will name the enemy clearly and promise to burn it down. Hyperinflation did not cause the Second World War on its own. History is never that simple. But it created the wound. It created the infection. It created the desperate readiness for a demagogue who spoke uncertainties to a people who had been destroyed by uncertainty. And yet, within this catastrophe, something happened that the history books mention briefly and then move past. Something that is, for the purposes of this story, the most important thing of all. Some people saw it coming. Not all of them were rich. Not all of them were powerful. Some of them were just paying attention to the right things. In the early 1920s, before the hyperinflation reached its worst phase, a small and quiet group of Germans began doing something that seemed eccentric at the time. They stopped holding savings in marks. They converted whatever they could into physical gold, or into foreign currencies, specifically Swiss francs and American dollars, or into physical goods, things that held real value regardless of what the paper said. Some bought farmland, some bought silver. Some bought a few months of food stored in their cellars. These were not wealthy speculators making clever bets. Many of them were modest people, tradespeople and craftsmen and small shop owners, who had simply read the signals correctly, who had noticed that when a government owes more than it can possibly repay and starts printing money to cover the gap, something eventually has to break. They did not know when it would break. They did not know exactly how bad it would get, but they prepared for the possibility that it would break badly, and they took steps to ensure that their survival did not depend entirely on a promise printed on paper by a government under pressure. And when the collapse came, they were not whole. Nobody was whole, but they were standing. They had something. While Heinrich stared at his kitchen wall, these people were quietly, without drama, converting their stored goods into marks to buy the assets that the desperate middle class was selling for almost nothing. Tragedy and opportunity, as always, arrived at the same time. They simply chose different doors. Now let us take an honest look at the mechanism that made all of this possible. Not the printing press itself, but the system of belief that allowed the printing press to function. Because a printing press is just a machine. The real engine of the Weimar disaster was something more subtle and more durable and more present in your life today than you have probably considered. The German mark before the First World War was, at least nominally, linked to gold. Not perfectly, not without manipulation, but the link existed. It created a constraint. If you printed too many marks, people could, in theory, demand gold in return. Gold is physical. Gold is limited. Gold cannot be created by a government decision at 3 a.m. The gold standard was imperfect and often gamed, but it functioned as a kind of leash on the printing press. The war changed everything. Wars are catastrophically expensive. No country in history has ever managed to fight a serious modern war while keeping its currency honest. The costs are simply too large. So Germany, like every other major combatant in the First World War, suspended the gold link when the war began in 1914. They told the public it was temporary, a wartime necessity, a patriotic sacrifice. It was not temporary. Once you remove the constraint, once you establish the precedent that the government can print as much as it needs when things get difficult, you have changed something fundamental. You have changed the nature of the relationship between the citizen and the currency. You have removed the leash, and a dog without a leash, in the hands of a panicking handler, will eventually run into traffic. The deeper manipulation, the one that Heinrich never understood and never could have understood without someone explaining it to him in plain language, was this: the German government was not stupid. The people running the central bank were not uninformed. They knew with reasonable precision what printing money does to its value. They had access to economic thinking that had been developed over centuries. They knew they were diluting the juice. They did it anyway, because the alternative, admitting openly that Germany could not pay its war debts, defaulting explicitly and publicly, negotiating from a position of acknowledged bankruptcy, was politically unbearable. It required honest conversation. It required a government standing before its citizens and saying, "We have made commitments we cannot keep. We need to renegotiate." It required humility and transparency from men who had built their careers on projecting strength and certainty. Printing money allowed them to avoid that conversation. It allowed them to pretend, for a while, that something real was happening, that the debt was being managed, that Germany was still solvent. The printing press was not just an economic tool. It was a political tool. It was a way of buying time, of postponing the honest reckoning, of letting the next set of officials deal with the consequences of this set of officials' decisions. The citizens paid for the delay with their savings, with their retirements, with their dignity, with their faith in institutions, with, ultimately, their political stability and their peace. Heinrich paid for the government's inability to have an honest conversation. And now, let us bring this out of the history books and into the present, not to make a specific political argument, not to predict a specific outcome, but to ask the question that this entire story has been building toward. What would Heinrich do differently if he could go back? Not what would he do to prevent the hyperinflation. One man cannot prevent hyperinflation. One man cannot stop a government that has decided to print its way out of a problem. The mechanisms of the state are not vulnerable to the objections of one factory worker in Leipzig. But what would Heinrich do to protect himself and his family from the consequences of those mechanisms? The answer is not complicated. It never was. The first thing he would do is stop believing that paper is the same as value. Paper, whether it is a banknote or a government bond or a savings account balance on a bank statement, is a promise. Promises can be broken. Promises made by governments under pressure are especially fragile. This is not cynicism. This is history. Read across any century, any continent, and you will find governments that have broken monetary promises when keeping them became too painful. This is not a critique of any one political system. It is a pattern of human behavior that repeats regardless of ideology. What holds value when paper fails? Things hold value. Physical things. Land that grows food. Tools that make goods. Metals that cannot be created by decree. Gold and silver, which human beings have used as stores of value for 5,000 years, not because they are beautiful, but because they are limited and cannot be printed. Skills hold value. The ability to fix an engine, to grow a crop, to heal a body, to build a shelter. These things cannot be inflated away. A government can print 1 trillion marks, but it cannot print a carpenter's knowledge. The second thing Heinrich would do is diversify away from a single promise maker. Do not hold all your savings in the currency of one government. Do not trust one institution with everything you have. This is not paranoia. This is risk management. The same principle that tells you not to keep all your food in one pantry that could flood applies to money. Spread your store of value across different forms, some cash for daily use, some physical metals for deep reserves, some productive assets that generate real output, some foreign assets in jurisdictions with different risks. The third thing, and this is the hardest one, is to think in terms of purchasing power rather than numbers. Heinrich was seduced by the number in his savings account. It was a large number. It felt like security. But a number in a currency that is being inflated is not a fixed thing. It is a shrinking thing, even when the number itself stays the same. The only question that matters is not how many marks do I have, but what can those marks actually buy me today compared to last year? And what will they buy me next year? If the answer to that question is moving in the wrong direction, the number in your account is irrelevant. You are getting poorer, regardless of what the statement says. This is the lesson that the Weimar disaster carved into history with a brutal and unforgiving hand. Not that inflation is bad. That is obvious and trivial. The lesson is that the systems we trust with our savings are operated by human beings who are capable of making choices that protect themselves at your expense. Not out of malice, necessarily. Out of the ordinary human tendency to choose a painful truth tomorrow over a comfortable lie today. The printing press is not evil. It is a tool. And like all tools, Its moral character is determined entirely by the hands that hold it and the desperation in those hands. When a government is solvent and confident and honest, the press sits quiet. When a government is over-indebted and frightened and cornered, the press starts to hum. And the first ones to feel the vibration are the last ones it will hurt. People like Heinrich, people who trusted the promise on the paper, people who spent a lifetime playing by the rules of a game that could be changed at any moment by the people who wrote the rules. There are Heinrichs in every generation, in every country, in every economic system that has ever existed. They are not stupid. They are not naive. They are simply trusting in a world that does not always reward trust. The question this story leaves you with is not a comfortable one. It is not a question with a clean answer or an easy solution. It is simply this: in your own life, in your own time, in the economy you live inside right now, how much of what you have built is real, and how much of it is a promise written on paper by someone who might one day find it inconvenient to keep? Heinrich thought he knew the answer. He was wrong. Make sure you know the answer before the printing press starts to hum.